Okay friends, it's time to get started on our job. One of the first things you want to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground and the suspension is hanging. The next thing you would want to do, if you have a hubcap over this area, you're going to find that you have 4 plastic lug nuts that you'd use a 19mm to loosen, and then you can remove the hubcap. After that, continue on by removing all of your 19mm lug nuts and then the wheel. With the wheel off of there, let's continue on with just putting on one of the lug nuts. I like to have a lug nut on here to hold the rotor in place so it doesn't shake around while I'm working. Alright, so I've got my nut on here, and as you can tell, looking at the brake rotor, it's in very poor condition. We're not worried about that for this video because we have one coming out showing you how to install the front brakes on this vehicle. Let's move along to removing our axle nut. To remove this, we're going to use a 30mm socket. Now typically it's a good idea to go ahead and replace the axle nut anytime you remove it, but generally, if it's in good enough condition and you have some red thread locker, you should be all set with that. Now behind this area there's also going to be a washer, but you don't necessarily have to remove that. The only thing we're doing at this point is we're going to come right in the center with a punch and a hammer. We want to try to break the axle free from the wheel bearing. Now once you have some movement from the axle, we can continue. We're going to be looking for where the control arm and ball joint go into the knuckle. Right up here, you're going to find that you have a 15mm headed nut that's holding on to a 16mm headed bolt that comes through from the front. So with that said, I'll use my 16mm wrench on the forward aspect, and then I'll remove the nut with my 15mm. Inspect your hardware as you remove it. Make sure it's still reusable. If it's not, go ahead and replace it as needed. Now to start breaking this free, I'm going to use some penetrant in the area. After that, I'll start spinning the bolt to break it free, and then I'll give it a couple loving bonks just to help drive it out. Well, it looks like just turning it out worked. We'll give that a close inspection and then set it aside. Now that I have the pinch bolt out of there, I'm going to continue on with a prying device. I also want to make sure that it's something that I can use a hammer on. I want to come right in between the separated area of the knuckle, right here. Now that I'm in between that area, I'm going to gently start tapping on this to try to spread the 2 ears. I don't want to damage the knuckle any, I just want to try to spread it enough so the ball joint will be able to come free. Let's get a little bit of penetrant in there and let it do its job. Now let's go ahead and follow that control arm to where it connects onto the subframe. You're going to find 2 15mm headed bolts that hold it to the subframe. Remove the pair. Now I'm going to go ahead and hold on to this piece right here. I'll fully remove my bolt, and then we can remove this area of the bracket as well. After you have that off, continue on to the other one. Do the exact same thing. Now we can follow that control arm to our rearward bushing bolt. Let's go ahead and use a 21mm socket to remove that. Make sure you give that bolt a very thorough inspection. It's an important bolt. Not only does it hold the control arm to the subframe, but it holds the subframe to the body of the vehicle as well. Now at this point, we're going to have to be very safe. What we need to do is continue separating the ball joint from the knuckle. At the same time, we're going to continue by pulling the control arm away from the subframe, and then we're going to take the whole control arm and try to slide it forward so it comes out of this area right here. There it is, friends. Before we continue putting in the control arm, let's clean up the area. The next thing I always like to do is use a little bit of lubricant in this area. I want to try to make it so it's as easy as possible to try to slide my rearward hockey puck bushing into this area as we install the control arm. We'll get some up in this area, and then of course down along the bottom. Whatever we can do to help make sure it doesn't bind. Now let's get ready to install our control arm. We're going to take this and try to put it in position. The first area that you want to pay attention to is the rearward hockey puck-like bushing. We want to get that slid into position so we can continue on with the other mounting points. Now just grab onto the knuckle. I'm going to give myself a little bit of wiggle room here. Now that we have it slid in back there, let's continue on by tugging on the knuckle a little bit. And then we're going to lift this up so it's in essentially the ride height position. Now if you were to look back at the hockey puck bushing, assuming it's lined up, you should be able to put your bolt straight up and through. Before you go ahead and put it in, make sure you use a little bit of red thread locker. At this point, we're going to leave this a little loose. We'll continue tightening and torquing everything to manufacturer's specifications, but before we do, let's move along to starting everything else in. Before you go ahead and put in your bolts, make sure you put on your brackets. Just slide that right on there. Red thread locker on our mounting bolts, of course. Just going to get this lined up. We'll do the same to the other one. We're leaving these a little loose as well. Now it's going to be time to put the ball joint stud into the knuckle. To do that, you can either carefully try to pull down on this by hand. If it seems as though it's a little stiff, you could also use a prying device inside of the upper hole on the control arm. Now we'll just wiggle this around until it sets in place. And now we're going to use a rubber mallet. When I use this, I want to carefully tap on this, but I do not want to tap on the ball joint itself. We do not want to damage the ball joint. Give it a close inspection, make sure it's completely seated. After that, we can continue on with our pinch bolt coming through from the front to the rear. Now it's going to be time to make sure you clean the threads on your pinch bolt. After I do that, I always apply a thin amount of copper never-seez to the smooth shanked area. never to the threaded area. That's going to be for thread locker once we get it in position. Start this in and through from the front to the rear. Drive it through. Now we can put on our mounting nut from the back side. Let's hold the bolt with a 16mm wrench and we'll tighten the nut. Now that we have that bottomed out, let's continue bottoming out the rest of the bolts, and then we will tighten them to manufacturer's specification. Now let's continue torquing this bolt to 37 foot-pounds. After you have it torqued to that, continue tightening it an additional 30 degrees. Now we can move along to the control arm to subframe bolts. We'll torque each of these to 41 foot-pounds. Now let's move along to our rearward bolt. For this one, you're going to torque it to 74 foot-pounds. After you torque it to 74, continue turning it half a turn, so 180 degrees. Tight. Let's continue on to the axle nut. I'll use some red thread locker. Now we're going to put on the mounting nut. Whenever you're installing one of these nuts, you want to make sure you put it on by hand. You can of course use a ratchet if you need to, but you never want to use an air gun because we don't want to damage the bearing located behind this. Let's remove our lug nut. Now we can get ready to reinstall our wheel. We're going to put on all 4 of our lug nuts, we'll bottom them out, get the wheel safely back down on the ground, and then we can torque each of the lug nuts to 100 foot-pounds. With the wheel safely back down on the ground, let's go ahead and torque that axle nut to 155 foot-pounds. Now we can torque the lug nuts to 100 foot-pounds. Torqued. If you have a plastic center cover, go ahead and put that on now. You want to make sure that the valve stem hole lines up with the valve stem, and then of course tighten up the covers to the lug nuts. Okay friends, we got the car back together. What's left to do now? Now of course you're going to want to make sure you take it for a road test. You want to listen for any funny noises and get yourself safely down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.